great clock fell before anyone could catch it. It slipped from the crate the movers were carrying, through the marble hallway of Grantham House, tipped sideways, and struck the stone floor with a sound that echoed through every room like a bone breaking. Glass shattered. Brass gears rolled across the tiles and spun to a stop under the legs of a chair. The tall wooden case cracked down the middle, and the hands of the clock froze at 11 minutes past 3, never to move again on their own. Duke Alistair Grantham stood at the top of the staircase and watched it happen. For one long moment he could not speak. The clock had belonged to his family for over 150 years. It had been given to his great-grandfather by a king, who wished to reward loyalty with something rare and beautiful. A clock that did not simply tell the hour, but tracked the movement of the moon, marked the turning of the seasons, and rang a soft chime on the anniversary of the family's oldest triumphs. Every important date in the Grantham family had been measured by its ticking. Every wedding, every birth, every farewell. Now it lay broken on the floor, and the silence where its ticking used to be felt louder than any noise. "Get it up," the Duke said, his voice tight. "Carefully. Now." The movers scrambled to obey, but the damage was already done. As two footmen lifted the shattered case back onto its feet, more pieces fell loose from inside. Tiny gears and springs, scattering like seeds thrown from a careless hand. The Duke's daughter, Charlotte, came running down the stairs at the sound, her face going pale when she saw the ruined clock standing crooked in the hallway, its glass face split in a long, jagged line. "Father," she said, "the gala is in 11 days. The Duke did not answer at first. He walked slowly toward the clock, knelt beside it, and studied the wreckage with the expression of a man staring into an open wound. Every year, on the same night, the Grantham family held a gala to mark the anniversary of an ancestor's return from a long and dangerous voyage, an event the clock itself was built to commemorate. The clock did not simply belong to the family. It was the family, in wood and brass and glass. If it did not chime on the night of the gala, for the first time in 150 years, every guest in that room would know it, and every whisper afterward would carry the same question. What else has the Grantham family let fall apart? "Send for someone," the Duke said quietly. "Send for the best clockmaker in London, today." The housekeeper, Margaret Doyle, who had served the family for over 20 years, was already writing down names before he finished speaking. By the next afternoon, a clockmaker named Cornelius Ashgrove arrived at Grantham House in a hired carriage, carrying a leather case of tools and an expression of complete confidence. He was known across the city for repairing clocks in the homes of earls and merchants alike, and he had never once failed to fix what he was asked to fix. He examined the broken case, lifted the loose gears with careful fingers, and promised the Duke that he would have the clock restored within 3 days. 3 days passed, then 4. On the 5th day, Cornelius Ashgrove packed his tools back into his leather case, his hands trembling slightly, and admitted that he could not understand the mechanism inside. It was unlike any clock he had studied. The gears did not turn the way gears should turn. The springs did not coil the way springs should coil. He apologized, refunded his fee without being asked, and left Grantham House looking like a man who had lost an argument with something he could not see. The Duke sent for another clockmaker, then another. Word spread quickly through the small, tightly knit world of London's finest craftsmen that the Grantham heirloom clock was broken, and that whoever managed to repair it before the gala would earn a reputation that would last a lifetime. 6 more clockmakers came to the house over the following days. Each one arrived with tools, confidence, and a long list of past successes. Each one left with none of these things intact. Some said the mechanism had been built using methods that no longer existed, secrets that had died with the craftsmen who made it. Others whispered that the clock was cursed, that it had chosen to break rather than be touched by unworthy hands. The Duke did not believe in curses, but as the days slipped away and the gala drew closer, he found himself pacing the hallway at night, staring at the broken clock standing silent and still, where it had always stood proud and ticking. Charlotte watched her father grow thinner with worry. She watched Margaret Doyle whisper anxiously with the butler, Edmund Price, about what would happen if the clock remained broken. She watched the family's oldest treasure become a symbol not of pride, but of failure. Word of the broken clock did not stay within the walls of Grantham House. Servants talked to servants. Merchants talked to customers. By the end of the first week, Half of London seemed to know that the great Grantham clock had fallen, and that no one, not even the city's most celebrated craftsman, could bring it back to life. In a narrow street on the poorer side of the city, far from the tall iron gates of Grantham House, a small shop sat wedged between a bakery and a shoemaker. A faded sign above the door read, "Whitfield's Clocks and Watches." Inside, shelves lined every wall, crowded with clocks of every size, some ticking steadily, some waiting patiently for repair. Behind the counter, a young woman named Eleanor Whitfield sat hunched over a small pocket watch, a magnifying lens fitted over one eye, her fingers moving with quiet, practiced precision. Eleanor was not the kind of person anyone noticed on a crowded street. She was plain, in the way that made people's eyes slide past her without stopping, dressed in clothes that had been mended more than once, her hair pulled back in a simple knot that had nothing fashionable about it. She had grown up in this shop, taught by her father from the time she was old enough to hold a screwdriver without dropping it. While other girls her age had learned to dance and embroider, Eleanor had learned the language of gears and springs, the quiet logic hidden inside every ticking clock. Her father, Walter Whitfield, had once been known as a skilled craftsman himself, though never a famous one. He had never been invited to repair clocks in grand houses, never been given the chance to prove what he could do beyond the small, humble world of his shop. In recent years, his hands had begun to shake too much for delicate work, and it was Eleanor who now did most of the repairs, though the customers who came through the door often addressed their questions to him out of habit, as though a young woman could not possibly be the one solving their problems. Eleanor had grown used to being overlooked. It no longer stung the way it once had. She found a quiet kind of peace in her work, in the moment when a broken watch came back to life under her fingers, in the soft click of a gear finding its proper place. She did not need anyone to notice her, to know that she was good at what she did. It was a customer, an elderly woman who had come to have her mantel clock cleaned, who first told Eleanor about the Duke's broken heirloom. "They say it's cursed," the woman said, shaking her head as Eleanor worked. 7 clockmakers, my dear. 7. And not one of them could fix it. The finest in London, all beaten by a pile of old gears. Eleanor said nothing, but something in her chest quickened at the words. She thought of the astronomical clocks she had read about in her father's old books, the rare kind that tracked not just the hour, but the movement of the stars and moon, built using techniques that had mostly been lost to time. She thought of the quiet satisfaction of solving a puzzle no one else could solve. She did not say anything to the woman about what she was thinking. She simply nodded, finished the repair, and returned to her work. But that night, after the shop had closed and her father had gone to bed, Eleanor sat by the low fire with one of her father's old books open on her lap, reading about the mechanisms of grand astronomical clocks, until the candle burned low and her eyes grew heavy. She told herself it was only curiosity. She told herself that a girl from a small shop on a narrow street had no business thinking about a duke's broken treasure. But some small, stubborn part of her had already begun to wonder what she would see if she were ever given the chance to look inside that clock herself. The gala was now 9 days away. In the grand hallway of Grantham House, the broken clock stood silent, its cracked glass face reflecting the flickering candlelight, waiting for someone who had not yet arrived. 8 famous clockmakers had now failed, and the 9th was expected within the hour. Duke Alistair Grantham stood at the window of his study, watching the carriage circle up the long gravel drive, and felt none of the hope he had felt the first time. Hope, he had learned over the past week, was a thing that wore thin with repetition. The 9th clockmaker was a man named Reginald Hargrove, and he was, by every account in London, the most respected of them all. He had repaired clocks for 2 earls and a foreign ambassador. He wore a coat of fine dark wool, and carried himself with the certainty of a man who had never once doubted his own skill. When he stepped down from the carriage and looked up at the tall stone front of Grantham House, he smiled the smile of someone who already believed the job was finished before it had begun. "Your Grace," he said, bowing low as the Duke came out to greet him. "I understand 8 men have already tried and failed. I do not intend to be the 9th. The Duke wanted very badly to believe him. Hargrove was led to the hallway where the clock stood, its case still cracked, its face still frozen, at 11 minutes past 3. He circled it slowly, running his fingers along the wood, opening the small door at the back to peer inside at the tangle of gears and springs. For a long while he said nothing at all. and the silence in the hallway grew heavy enough that Charlotte, watching from the staircase, found herself holding her breath. "Curious," Hargrove murmured at last. "Very curious indeed." He worked for the rest of that day, and long into the evening, refusing offers of food, refusing offers of rest, muttering to himself as he turned tiny screws and lifted delicate gears with a pair of thin silver tools. By the following morning, he had made more progress than any clockmaker before him. The clock's hands, which had been frozen since the fall, twitched once, then twice, as though something inside had stirred back to life. For a brief, shining moment, the household believed the crisis was over. Margaret Doyle wept with relief in the kitchen. Edmund Price sent word to the staff that preparations for the gala could resume without fear. The Duke allowed himself, for the first time in days, to smile. But by that evening, the clock had stopped again, its hands drooping back to stillness, and this time something worse had happened. In his eagerness to force the mechanism to work, Hargrove had pushed too hard against a delicate part deep inside the casing, and it had snapped. A thin sliver of aged brass, older than anyone in the house, lay broken in 2 pieces on the velvet cloth spread beneath the clock. Hargrove's confident smile vanished. He held the broken piece up to the light with shaking hands, turning it over, as though staring at it long enough might make it whole again. "This is beyond repair," he said finally, his voice much quieter than it had been the day before. "This piece was made using a method I have never seen. I cannot forge a replacement without understanding how it was built, and I do not understand how it was built. No one alive understands how it was built." The Duke's face went the color of ash. "You have made it worse." "Your Grace, I assure you, I did everything a craftsman of my experience." "You have made it worse," the Duke repeated, and this time his voice cracked with something close to despair. "Leave my house." Hargrove left that same night, his reputation, for the first time in his career, badly bruised. But it was not only his reputation that suffered. Word of the broken piece spread through London faster than any rumor before it. It was no longer simply a story of a stubborn old clock resisting repair. Now it was a story of a treasure being destroyed, piece by piece, by every hand that touched it. Some began to say the clock was doomed. Others said the Grantham family's luck itself had broken along with it. The gala was now 7 days away, and the Duke had run out of names to send for. Every clockmaker of any real reputation in London had either already tried and failed, or had heard enough of what happened to Hargrove to refuse the invitation altogether. Margaret Doyle sat with the Duke late into the night, turning over old letters and business cards, searching for anyone they might have overlooked. It was Charlotte, restless and unable to sleep, who wandered down to the kitchens near midnight and overheard 2 of the younger servants talking. One of them, a girl who helped in the laundry, mentioned that her own family took their broken watches to a small shop near the market, run by a father and his daughter, and that the daughter, though quiet and plain, had a gift for fixing things no one else could fix. "They say she mended old Mrs. Aldridge's musical clock," the laundry girl was saying. "The one that hadn't chimed in 10 years. Fixed it in an afternoon. She did, and charged half what the fancy shops would have asked." Charlotte stood very still in the doorway, listening. "It's probably nothing," the other servant said. "A little shop like that. What could a girl like her know about a clock like the Duke's?" But Charlotte had heard enough. The next morning, over a breakfast neither of them touched, she told her father what she had overheard. The Duke listened with visible skepticism, his exhaustion plain on his face. "A shop girl," he said flatly. "Charlotte, the finest clockmakers in England have failed. What could a girl from a market stall possibly do that they could not?" "I don't know," Charlotte admitted. "But father, we have tried everyone else. What harm is there in trying her as well?" The Duke was silent for a long moment, staring down at his cold tea. Pride told him to refuse. Pride told him that inviting a shop girl to touch the family's most treasured possession, after 9 trained professionals had already failed, would only invite more mockery, more whispers, more damage to a name that was already bleeding from 100 small cuts. But beneath the pride was something else, something quieter and more desperate. 7 days remained until the gala. He had nothing left to lose but his pride, and his pride had already been lost days ago. "Send word to the shop," he said at last, so quietly that Charlotte nearly missed it. "Find out her name." Margaret Doyle was given the task of making the inquiry, though she did not do it herself. She sent Edmund Price, who did not approve of the idea in the slightest, and made no effort to hide it. He arrived at Whitfield's Clocks and Watches that same afternoon, stepping carefully over the uneven cobblestones, as though the narrow street itself might soil the fine fabric of his coat. Inside the shop, Eleanor was cleaning the inner workings of an old carriage clock when the bell above the door rang, and a tall, stiffly dressed man stepped inside, looking around at the crowded shelves with an expression of poorly hidden distaste. "I am looking for the clockmaker," Edmund Price said. Eleanor set down her tools and rose from her stool. "That would be my father, sir, though he is resting just now. I am able to help you, if you would allow me." Edmund Price studied her for a long moment, taking in her plain dress, her ink-stained fingers, the modest little shop that smelled faintly of oil and old wood. Whatever he had expected to find, it was clearly not this. "I have come on behalf of the Duke of Grantham," he said, and watched carefully for her reaction. "His family's clock has been damaged. 9 of London's finest craftsmen have attempted to repair it and failed. I am told, on the word of the servants, that you may have some small skill in these matters." Eleanor's heart quickened, though she kept her face calm. She had heard the rumors, of course. Everyone in London had heard them by now, but she had never imagined the story would find its way to her own door. "I would be honored to see it," she said simply. Edmund Price's mouth tightened, as though her calm confidence offended him more than nervous stammering would have. "The Duke has not yet agreed to allow you into the house. I am here only to gather information, on the housekeeper's request, nothing more. Tell me what training you have received, and I will report it back." Eleanor described her years working beside her father, the countless clocks she had repaired, the 2 years she had spent studying an old book on astronomical mechanisms that had once belonged to a craftsman long since passed away. She spoke plainly, without exaggeration, because exaggeration had never once been necessary in her work. Edmund Price listened, wrote a few brief notes, and left without offering any promise at all. For 3 days, Eleanor heard nothing further. She continued her work at the shop, telling herself she should not have expected anything different. A duke's household had no real reason to trust a stranger, and certainly no reason to trust a young woman from a shop most of London had never heard of. She tried not to think of the clock, of the puzzle waiting inside its broken case, but at night, when the shop was quiet and her father slept, she found her thoughts returning to it again and again, imagining the shape of gears she had never seen. On the 4th day, a letter arrived at the shop, sealed with the Grantham family crest. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal and read the short, formally worded message inside. She was invited, it said, to examine the clock at Grantham House the following morning. No promises were made. No payment was guaranteed. It was, the letter made clear, simply an opportunity to look, nothing more. It was, Eleanor thought, as she read the words a second time, more than she had dared to hope for. Her father, when she told him the news that evening, set down his tea with a hand that shook more from emotion than from age. "The Grantham clock," he said softly, almost reverently. "I have heard stories about that clock since I was younger than you are now. If you succeed where 9 trained men have failed, Eleanor, it will change everything." "And if I fail?" Eleanor asked quietly. Her father reached across the table and took her hand in his. "Then you will have tried something worth trying, and no one who truly understands this work will think less of you for it. But I do not believe you will fail." That night, Eleanor could not sleep. She lay awake staring at the ceiling of the small room above the shop, running through everything she knew about astronomical clocks, every diagram she had studied, every strange and delicate mechanism described in her father's old books. Somewhere across the city, in a grand hallway lit by candlelight, the broken clock stood waiting, its hands frozen forever at 11 minutes past 3, as though time itself had paused to see what would happen next. The morning Eleanor arrived at Grantham House, she wore her best dress, a plain gray wool that had been her mother's before it was hers, and carried a small leather case of tools that had belonged to her father since before she was born. She had walked the entire distance from the shop rather than spend money on a carriage, and by the time the tall iron gates of the estate came into view, her feet ached and her hands were cold. But her resolve had not weakened at all. A guard at the gate looked her over with open suspicion. "Deliveries go around to the back," he said, waving her toward a narrow side path. "I am not a delivery," Eleanor said, keeping her voice steady. "I have been invited to examine the Duke's clock. My name is Eleanor Whitfield." The guard frowned, clearly doubting her, but after a moment he sent a boy running up to the house to check. Eleanor waited at the gate, watching the grand house rise before her, its windows tall and gleaming, its gardens trimmed into perfect, orderly rows. She had never stood so close to a place like this. It was easy, standing there in the cold morning air, to feel very small indeed. When the boy returned, he nodded, and the guard stepped aside to let her pass, though his expression made it clear he still did not quite believe she belonged there. Eleanor walked up the long gravel drive alone, her tool case held tightly in both hands, and told herself, with every step, that skill did not care what a person was wearing, or where they had come from. She was met at the front door not by the Duke, but by Edmund Price, whose face wore the same careful, unwelcoming politeness it had worn in her shop. "You are early," he said, though she was not. "I did not wish to be late," Eleanor replied. He led her through the grand hallway, past paintings taller than she was, past a staircase wide enough to hold a dozen people walking abreast, and she tried not to let her eyes wander too openly, though it was difficult not to stare. Servants passed them in the hall, glancing at her with open curiosity, whispering to one another once they thought she was out of earshot. Eleanor kept her chin level and her steps even, though her heart beat fast beneath her plain gray dress. At last they reached the hallway where the clock stood, and for a moment, Eleanor forgot to be nervous at all. The clock was taller than she had imagined, its wooden case rising nearly to the ceiling, carved with delicate images of stars and crescent moons along its edges. Even broken, even with its glass face cracked and its hands frozen and still, it was the most beautiful piece of craftsmanship she had ever seen. She felt something in her chest tighten, not with fear, but with a fierce and sudden longing to understand it, to know exactly how it had been built and exactly what had gone wrong. She was not given long to look. Miss Whitfield, the voice belonged to a woman Eleanor recognized at once as Margaret Doyle, the housekeeper, from the kind but tired way she carried herself. "The Duke will see you before you are permitted near the clock." Eleanor was led to a small sitting room where Duke Alistair Grantham sat waiting, his face lined with exhaustion he had clearly tried and failed to hide. Beside him stood his daughter, Charlotte, watching Eleanor with open curiosity, rather than the suspicion the other servants had shown. "Miss Whitfield," the Duke said, studying her carefully, "you understand that 9 of the most respected clockmakers in London have already examined this clock and failed." "I understand, Your Grace. You are quite young." "I have been repairing clocks since I was 7 years old," Eleanor said simply. "Age has never been the measure of skill in my father's shop." The Duke's eyebrows lifted slightly at her steady tone, and for a moment, something like curiosity flickered across his tired face. "Very well. You may examine the clock. I make no promise beyond that. If you cause any further damage, you will be held responsible, and I will not be gentle about it. Do you understand?" "I understand, Your Grace. I would not touch anything without being certain first." He studied her a moment longer, then gave a small, tired nod. "You have 1 hour to look, nothing more, for now." Eleanor was led back to the hallway, where the broken clock waited beneath the tall windows, sunlight falling across its cracked glass face in long golden bars. Edmund Price stood nearby, arms crossed, clearly intending to watch her every movement. A few curious servants lingered at the edges of the hall, pretending to dust furniture that did not need dusting, unable to resist the chance to see whether the shopgirl would embarrass herself. Eleanor set down her tool case, knelt before the clock, and opened the small door at its back, just as Cornelius Ashgrove and Reginald Hargrove had done before her. Inside the mechanism was a dense tangle of gears, springs, and delicate rods, more intricate than anything she had ever seen in her father's shop. For a long moment she simply looked, letting her eyes trace the shapes and connections, saying nothing at all. "Well?" Edmund Price asked, his tone somewhere between impatience and quiet hope that she would fail quickly. "Please," Eleanor said softly, without looking up. "I need quiet to think." Something in the calm certainty of her voice made even Edmund Price fall silent. She examined the broken piece that Hargrove had snapped, turning it gently between her fingers, studying the strange curved shape of it, unlike any gear or spring she had studied in her father's books. She examined the frozen hands, the cracked glass, the small dial on the clock's face that, she realized with quiet excitement, was meant to track the phases of the moon, rather than simply the hour and minute. She noticed something the other clockmakers, in their eagerness to force the mechanism back to life, appeared to have overlooked entirely. A very small lever, tucked behind the main gear assembly, worn smooth from age, that did not seem connected to anything at all. She did not touch it. Not yet. She only looked, and thought, and let the shape of the puzzle begin to form in her mind. The hour passed quickly. When Margaret Doyle returned to tell her that her time was finished, Eleanor rose slowly, brushing dust from her skirt, her mind still turning over everything she had seen. "Well?" the Duke asked when she was brought before him again. "Have you found what 9 trained men could not?" Eleanor hesitated. She did not want to promise more than she could deliver, but she also did not want to hide what she had begun to understand. "I have an idea, Your Grace. I cannot be certain until I look further, but I believe the other clockmakers made a mistake in how they approached the mechanism. They tried to force the hands to move, when I believe the true fault lies elsewhere, in a smaller part they may not have noticed at all. And what part is that? A small lever, hidden behind the central gear. I believe it may control the moon dial, rather than the hour hand directly, and I believe it has become disconnected, not broken, simply loose. If I am right, the clock may not need to be rebuilt at all. It may only need to be reconnected." The Duke exchanged a glance with his daughter, and for the first time in many days, something that was not quite hope, but was close to it, crossed his tired face. "You believe you can fix it," he said slowly, "in less time, and with less damage, than 9 of London's finest craftsmen." "I believe it is possible, Your Grace. I cannot promise it, but I believe it is possible." Edmund Price, standing near the doorway, made a small sound of disbelief that he did not quite manage to hide. The Duke glanced at him, then back at Eleanor, weighing her words carefully. "You will be given a chance," he said finally. "Tomorrow. You will work under close watch, and if you damage the clock further, you will bear full responsibility for it. Is that understood?" "Understood, Your Grace," Eleanor said, and though her heart was pounding, her voice remained steady. As she was led back out through the grand hallway, past the paintings and the wide staircase, Eleanor allowed herself, for just a moment, a small and private smile. She had walked through a door that had been closed to her only hours before, and though it had opened only a crack, it was enough. Tomorrow she would be given the chance that 9 trained men had already wasted, and she did not intend to waste it herself. News that a shop girl had been given permission to touch the Duke's broken heirloom spread through Grantham House before Eleanor had even left the property. By evening it had reached the kitchens, the stables, and the servants' quarters, and by the following morning, somehow, it had reached the ears of Reginald Hargrove himself, still nursing the wound of his own failure. He arrived at Grantham House uninvited, dressed in the same fine dark coat he had worn during his own attempt, his expression a careful mixture of concern and thinly disguised satisfaction. "Your Grace," he said, bowing to the Duke in the entrance hall, "I heard a troubling rumor, and felt it my duty to come at once. Surely you do not intend to allow an untrained girl to touch what 9 trained men could not repair." The Duke's jaw tightened. He had not forgotten how Hargrove's own confidence had ended in a snapped piece of irreplaceable brass. "She has not yet touched anything, Mr. Hargrove. She has only been given permission to try. With respect, Your Grace, I broke that piece by accident, after years of training and careful work. What damage might an untrained hand cause, working without proper caution?" Hargrove's voice carried just enough concern to sound reasonable, though beneath it, Eleanor, arriving at that very moment, and overhearing the tail end of his words from the doorway, could hear something closer to wounded pride. She said nothing as she stepped into the hall, her tool case in hand, though her cheeks warmed at being spoken of as though she were not standing right there. "Mr. Hargrove," she said quietly, once he had turned and noticed her, "I do not intend to force the mechanism the way it was forced before. I believe that is what caused the piece to break in the first place." Hargrove turned to look at her fully for the first time, his eyes moving over her plain dress and her simple leather tool case with obvious disdain. "You believe? A girl who has spent her life fixing pocket watches for shopkeepers believes she understands a mechanism that has defeated the finest craftsmen in England. I do not claim to understand all of it, Eleanor said, keeping her voice level despite the heat rising in her chest. I only ask for the chance to look more closely and see if I am right. And if you are wrong, if you break something else, something that cannot be mended by anyone, ever again. The hallway had gone quiet. Margaret Doyle stood near the staircase, her hands twisted anxiously in her apron. Charlotte watched from a few steps up, her expression tense. Even the Duke, though he had already given his permission, seemed to waver slightly under the weight of Hargrove's words. Eleanor took a slow breath. Then, the clock will be no more broken than it already is, Mr. Hargrove. It does not currently work at all. I cannot make silence louder than silence already is. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, to Eleanor's surprise, it was Charlotte who broke the quiet. She is right, Father. The clock does not work now. If she cannot fix it, we have lost nothing we have not already lost. But if she can. The Duke looked between his daughter, the girl standing calmly despite the weight of every eye in the room, and Hargrove, whose pride had clearly not recovered from his own failure. At last he straightened his shoulders. My decision stands, Mr. Hargrove. Miss Whitfield will be given her chance tomorrow, as promised. I thank you for your concern, but it is no longer required. Hargrove's mouth thinned into a hard line, but he said nothing further. He bowed stiffly, cast one last cold glance at Eleanor, and left the house without another word. Eleanor watched him go, her heart still pounding from the exchange, and told herself that his doubt did not matter. Only the clock mattered now, and the quiet certainty growing steadily inside her, that she understood, at last, what the others had missed. That afternoon, she was allowed to return to the hallway and examine the mechanism more closely, though this time under the watchful eyes of not only Edmund Price, but the Duke himself, who seemed unable to stay away despite his exhaustion. Eleanor worked slowly and carefully, tracing the path of every gear with her fingertips, testing the small worn lever she had noticed the day before without yet moving it, studying the way the moon dial connected, or failed to connect, to the rest of the mechanism. You have been very quiet, the Duke observed, watching her from a chair that had been brought into the hallway for him. I am listening to the clock, Your Grace, Eleanor said, without looking up, or trying to. A mechanism this delicate was built by someone who thought very carefully about every piece. I believe if I listen closely enough to how it was built, it will tell me how it broke. The Duke said nothing for a long moment, watching her work with an expression Eleanor could not quite read. My grandfather used to say something similar, he said finally, quietly. That the clock was less a machine, and more a kind of memory. He said it remembered every hand that had ever touched it. Eleanor looked up at him then, surprised by the softness in his voice. Then I will try to touch it gently, Your Grace, so that whatever it remembers of me is kind. The Duke's tired face shifted, just slightly, into something that was almost a smile. By the end of that second day of examination, Eleanor had not yet made a single repair, but she had done something none of the other clockmakers had bothered to do. She had understood the clock, not simply as a broken machine to be forced back into motion, but as a careful, deliberate design, built by someone who had thought about every gear and every spring with patience and love. She believed, more firmly than ever, that the small worn lever hidden behind the central gear was the key to everything, and that tomorrow, if she was careful, if she was patient, she would prove it. That night, walking home through the quiet streets with her tool case in hand, Eleanor thought of her father waiting for her at the shop, of the years of quiet work that had led her to this moment, and of the doubt she had seen in Hargrove's eyes, the same doubt she had seen in 100 other eyes throughout her life. She did not feel angry about it anymore. She felt, instead, a calm and steady resolve, the kind that came from knowing exactly what needed to be done, and trusting, at last, in her own two hands to do it. The morning of Eleanor's third visit to Grantham House, the sky hung low and gray, threatening rain that never quite arrived. She walked the familiar road from the shop with her tool case in hand, her father's words from the night before still echoing in her mind. He had gripped her hand across the kitchen table and told her, quietly, that whatever happened that day, she had already proven something no one could take from her, simply by being given the chance to try. But doubt had not left her entirely. As she walked through the tall iron gates and up the long gravel drive, she found herself thinking of everything that could go wrong. 9 trained men had failed before her. One had broken an irreplaceable piece trying to force the mechanism to move. If she made the same mistake, if her theory about the small worn lever proved wrong, she would not simply fail. She might destroy, beyond any hope of repair, the one thing the Grantham family valued above almost everything else. She pushed the thought away as she reached the front steps of the house. Fear had never fixed a single clock in her life, and she did not intend to let it start now. Inside, the atmosphere was tense in a way it had not been the day before. Word had spread further through the household overnight, and it seemed as though every servant who could find an excuse to linger near the hallway had done so. Margaret Doyle stood near the staircase, wringing her hands. Edmund Price stood near the clock itself, his arms crossed, his expression carefully neutral, in a way that suggested he expected failure and did not wish to seem surprised by it. Charlotte sat on the bottom step of the staircase, watching with open, hopeful curiosity, and the Duke stood near the window, his face pale and drawn, as though he had not slept at all. "Miss Whitfield," he said when she entered, "you understand this is likely the final attempt before the gala. We have only 6 days remaining. If you cannot repair the clock today, I do not believe there will be time to send for anyone else, nor do I believe there is anyone else left to send for." Eleanor felt the weight of his words settle over her like a heavy coat. "I understand, Your Grace. Then you may begin." She knelt before the clock, opened the small door at its back once more, and this time, instead of only looking, she reached in with careful, steady fingers. The room around her seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere behind her, she was aware of Edmund Price shifting his weight, of Charlotte leaning forward slightly on the staircase, of the Duke standing very still by the window. She did her best to ignore all of it, to let the noise of watching eyes fade into silence, and to listen instead to the quiet logic of the mechanism in front of her. She found the small worn lever again, exactly where she remembered it, tucked behind the central gear where it would be easy to overlook unless a person was looking for it specifically. She traced its shape with her fingertip, following the thin rod it connected to, tracking it back through the tangle of gears until she found where it should have joined the moon dial mechanism. There, exactly as she had suspected, was a small gap, no wider than a hair, where 2 pieces that should have been touching had come apart in the fall. It was not broken. It was only disconnected, jarred loose by the force of the clock striking the floor. Eleanor's heart began to beat faster, not with fear now, but with the particular, quiet thrill of a puzzle finally making sense. "I believe I understand the problem, Your Grace," she said softly, without looking up from her work. "Well?" Edmund Price asked, unable to keep the doubt from his voice. "What is it, then, that 9 trained clockmakers could not see?" "They were looking at the hour hand," Eleanor said. "They assumed the clock had stopped because something inside it had broken in a way that prevented the hour hand from moving. But I do not believe that is what happened at all. I believe the hour mechanism itself is undamaged. I believe what actually happened is that the fall knocked loose a very small connection between the central gear and the moon dial. And because this clock was built so that every part depends on every other part working in harmony, the entire mechanism locked itself in place to protect itself from further damage. It did not break, Your Grace. It stopped itself, the way a person might hold very still after a fall, afraid that moving might make an injury worse." The Duke stepped closer, his tired eyes fixed on her with an intensity that had not been there before. "You are saying the other clockmakers were trying to force something to move that was never broken in the first place?" "Yes, Your Grace. I believe that is exactly what happened, and I believe that is why Mr. Hargrove's attempt caused a piece to snap. He was pushing against a mechanism that had locked itself deliberately, trying to force movement where the clock itself was resisting, out of design rather than damage." A long silence followed her words. Edmund Price's arms slowly uncrossed. Charlotte rose from the staircase step and came closer, her eyes wide with something that looked very much like hope. Even Margaret Doyle had stopped wringing her hands and stood watching with quiet astonishment. "If you are right," the Duke said slowly, "then the repair may be far simpler than any of us believed." "If I am right," Eleanor agreed. "I cannot be entirely certain until I try to reconnect the 2 pieces myself. But I believe, Your Grace, that this clock does not need to be rebuilt. It only needs to be reminded of how it was meant to work." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, studying the small, plain young woman kneeling before his family's greatest treasure, with such calm and steady certainty. 9 trained men, each far more experienced than she was, had stood in this same spot and found nothing but confusion, and in one case, disaster. And yet here she was, speaking of the clock not as a broken machine to be forced back into submission, but as something delicate and deliberate, something that deserved to be understood before it was touched. "Then do it," he said quietly. "Reconnect it, Miss Whitfield. Show us." Eleanor turned back to the clock, her hands steady despite the pounding of her heart, and reached carefully into the narrow gap behind the central gear, toward the small worn lever waiting silently in the dark. The gap Eleanor had found was smaller than she expected, so small that at first her fingers could not find it at all. She adjusted the small lamp Margaret Doyle had brought closer, tilting her head until the light fell directly into the narrow space behind the central gear, and there it was again, the thin sliver of darkness, where two pieces that had once been joined now sat just far enough apart to stop the entire clock in its tracks. She reached for the smallest tool in her case, a thin silver rod no wider than a needle, one her father had made himself many years ago for exactly this kind of delicate work. Slowly, carefully, she guided it into the gap, feeling for the edge of the disconnected piece. It did not move. Eleanor frowned slightly, adjusting her grip, trying again with the faintest increase in pressure. Still, nothing moved. For one cold, sudden moment, doubt rushed through her, sharp and unwelcome. Perhaps she had been wrong. Perhaps the piece was not simply disconnected after all, but bent, or cracked in some way too small to see, jammed against another gear in a manner that would require far more than a gentle nudge to correct. She was aware, without looking up, of the silence in the hallway growing heavier. She could feel Edmund Price watching, could feel the Duke's held breath, could sense Charlotte leaning forward, waiting. "Miss Whitfield?" the Duke asked quietly, and though his voice was calm, Eleanor could hear the fear beneath it. "One moment, Your Grace," she said, keeping her own voice steady, even as her heart raced. "I do not wish to force it. If I force it, I may break exactly what I am trying to save." She withdrew the thin silver rod and sat back on her heels for a moment, closing her eyes, forcing herself to think rather than react. Forcing had already failed 9 times. She would not let it fail a 10th. She thought again of everything she had studied about the mechanism, of the careful, deliberate way it had been built, and slowly, a new idea began to form. If the clock had locked itself in place to protect the delicate connection between the gears, perhaps the answer was not to push the loose piece forward, but to gently rotate the central gear itself, just slightly, in the same direction the clock's hands would naturally move, easing the tension that was holding everything frozen in place. It was a small difference, a matter of angle rather than force, but Eleanor had learned, over years of quiet work in her father's shop, that the smallest differences were often the ones that mattered most. She opened her eyes, reached again for the thin silver rod, and this time, instead of pushing directly at the gap, she used it to apply the gentlest possible pressure to the edge of the central gear, coaxing it to turn just the width of a single hair. Something inside the clock shifted. It was such a small sound, barely more than a whisper of metal against metal, that for a moment Eleanor was not certain she had truly heard it at all. But then, beneath her fingers, she felt it, the faint, unmistakable click of 2 pieces sliding back into place, fitting together exactly as they had been designed to fit, over 100 years before she had ever been born. She let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "I believe," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly with something between exhaustion and hope, "that the connection has been restored." "Believe?" Edmund Price repeated, though his tone had lost most of its earlier sharpness. "Can you not be certain?" Eleanor looked up at him, then at the Duke, then finally down at her own hands, still resting gently against the delicate mechanism she had spent 3 days coming to understand. "I will be certain," she said, "the moment the clock begins to move." She reached for the small crank at the base of the clock's case, the one used to wind the mechanism after any repair, and began, slowly and carefully, to turn it. The room held its breath around her. Margaret Doyle pressed a hand to her chest. Charlotte gripped the edge of the staircase railing. The Duke stood utterly still, his eyes fixed on the frozen hands of the clock, hands that had not moved on their own in nearly 2 weeks. Eleanor finished winding the mechanism, withdrew her hands slowly, and stepped back. For one long, agonizing moment, nothing happened at all. Then, slowly, so slowly that at first it seemed like nothing more than a trick of the candlelight. The long minute hand of the great clock began to move. It was such a small motion, barely a fraction of an inch, that for a heartbeat no one in the hallway seemed to breathe at all. Then the hand shifted again and again, gathering a steady, gentle rhythm, and beneath the cracked glass face, deep inside the wooden case, a soft mechanical hum began to rise, quiet at first, then growing steadily louder, like something enormous, slowly waking from a very long sleep. "It is moving," Charlotte whispered, her hand pressed to her mouth. "Father, it is moving." The Duke stepped forward, his tired eyes fixed on the hands of the clock, as though he could not quite trust what he was seeing. The minute hand continued its steady climb, and a moment later, with a soft mechanical click that echoed through the hallway like a held breath finally released, the small moon dial above the main face began to turn as well, its painted crescent sliding slowly into a new position for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. Eleanor stood very still, watching the mechanism she had studied so carefully finally come back to life beneath her hands. She did not smile yet. She did not quite believe it herself. Not fully. Not until she heard the sound she had been waiting for, since the moment she first knelt before the broken case. The clock began, softly at first, to chime. It was not the full, rich chime it would have played on the hour, but a smaller, gentler sound, the kind of quiet music a clock made, simply to announce that it was, once again, alive and keeping time. The soft notes rang out through the hallway, bouncing off the marble floors and the tall painted ceiling, filling the silence that had hung over Grantham House for nearly 2 weeks, with something warm and impossibly welcome. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Margaret Doyle burst into tears, pressing both hands to her face, and Charlotte let out a sound that was half laugh and half sob, rushing forward to throw her arms around her father's neck. Edmund Price stood frozen near the clock, his mouth slightly open, staring at Eleanor as though seeing her for the very first time. The Duke did not move at all. He stood perfectly still, staring at the softly chiming clock, his eyes bright with tears he made no effort to hide. When at last he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "In 1 hour," he said. "You have done in 1 hour what 9 of the finest craftsmen in England could not do in 9 days. Eleanor, still kneeling before the clock, felt her own eyes sting with something she had not expected, a rush of relief and disbelief so strong it nearly took her breath away. She had believed in her theory, had trusted her own careful reasoning, but some small part of her, the part that had spent a lifetime being overlooked, had not truly dared to hope for a moment like this. "I did not rebuild anything, Your Grace," she said softly, her voice unsteady. "I only listened to what the clock was trying to tell everyone all along. It was never truly broken. It was only waiting for someone to understand it, rather than force it." The Duke crossed the hallway slowly and knelt beside her, an act so unexpected from a man of his standing that even Edmund Price, still frozen near the wall, seemed too stunned to react. He looked at the clock, its hands moving steadily now, its moon dial turning gently in the candlelight, and then he looked at Eleanor, plain and quiet and utterly unremarkable in every way except the one that mattered most. "My grandfather told me once," he said quietly, "that this clock would only ever truly work again for someone who loved it as much as the man who built it did." I did not believe him. I thought it was simply a story he told to make an old, fragile machine seem more important than it was. He shook his head slowly, staring at her with something close to wonder. "I do not think it was only a story, Miss Whitfield." Eleanor did not know how to answer him. She looked down at her own hands, still faintly trembling, and then up at the clock, its hands ticking steadily forward for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, and felt, for the first time in her life, the strange and unfamiliar warmth of being truly seen. Behind them, word was already beginning to spread through the house, servant to servant, room to room, the way news always spread fastest when it was least expected. By evening, it would reach the kitchens, the stables, the gates. By the following morning, it would reach the streets of London itself, carried by messengers, and gossiping merchants, and servants, eager to share what they had witnessed with their own eyes. The plain girl from the small shop near the market had done, in a single hour, what 9 of London's finest clockmakers had failed to do in nearly 2 weeks. Grantham House would not be quiet again for a very long time. By the following morning, The story of the Grantham clock had traveled across half of London. It passed from the servants of Grantham House to the merchants who supplied the kitchens, from the merchants to their customers, from the customers to their neighbors, growing a little larger and a little more remarkable with every telling. By the time it reached the wealthier corners of the city, where the 9 famous clockmakers who had already failed still lived and worked, the story had become impossible to ignore. A young woman, plain and untrained by any formal standard, had repaired in a single hour what 9 of the country's most celebrated craftsmen could not repair in nearly 2 weeks. Cornelius Ashgrove heard the news from a customer while cleaning the workings of an old mantel clock and set down his tools so quickly that he nearly knocked the piece to the floor. Reginald Hargrove heard it from a fellow clockmaker at the small club where the city's finest craftsmen often gathered to discuss their work, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, simply staring into his cup of tea, as though the news might somehow rearrange itself into something less humiliating if he waited long enough. "A shop girl," one of the other clockmakers said, shaking his head in disbelief. "From a market stall. Fix the Grantham clock in an hour, they say." "Impossible," Hargrove muttered, though even as he said the word, he found himself remembering the strange, worn lever he had noticed, but never fully understood. The one he had pushed against so forcefully that a piece of century-old brass had snapped beneath his hands. He remembered, too, Eleanor's calm voice in the hallway of Grantham House, her quiet certainty that the mechanism had not broken, only locked itself in place. At the time, he had dismissed her words as the confused guessing of an untrained mind. Now, sitting in the quiet corner of his club with the truth of what had happened settling slowly over him, he was no longer certain of that at all. At Grantham House itself, the mood had shifted entirely. Where once the hallway had echoed with anxious whispers and quiet despair, it now filled each morning with the steady, comforting tick of the great clock, its hands moving smoothly across its repaired glass face, its moon dial turning gently through its slow and ancient rhythm. Servants who had once hurried past the broken clock with worried glances now paused to admire it, some even reaching out to touch the polished wood, as though to reassure themselves it was truly whole again. The Duke, for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, slept through the night without waking. Charlotte, who had spent the past days pale and anxious, found her appetite returning along with her spirits. Even Margaret Doyle, who had wept with relief the moment the clock began to chime, moved through her duties with a lightness that had been missing since the accident first occurred. But it was Eleanor whose life had changed most of all, though she herself had not yet fully understood the extent of it. She returned to Whitfield's Clocks and Watches that afternoon, to find a small crowd already gathered outside the door, drawn by rumors that had somehow reached the narrow street even before she had. Her father stood in the doorway, his face bright with pride he could not begin to hide, and when Eleanor pushed through the small crowd toward him, he pulled her into an embrace that lasted a long moment before he finally let her go. "They are saying you fixed the Grantham clock," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "In an hour, Eleanor. Is it true?" "It is true," Eleanor admitted, still faintly dazed by the events of the day. Word continued to spread over the following days, and with it came a steady stream of visitors to the small shop, some simply curious to see the young woman everyone was speaking of, others hoping she might look at a broken clock or watch of their own, drawn by the sudden belief that a girl who could repair the Grantham heirloom might work wonders on lesser treasures as well. Eleanor found herself, for the first time in her life, unable to keep up with the demand for her skill, working long hours alongside her father, who watched her with a quiet, tearful pride that he made no effort to hide. Not everyone who came to the shop came with kindness, however. On the 3rd day after the repair, a well-dressed man Eleanor did not recognize entered the shop and studied her with an expression of open skepticism. "You are the girl who fixed the Grantham clock," he said, his tone somewhere between curiosity and challenge. "I am. I find that difficult to believe." 9 trained clockmakers, all of them men of considerable reputation, failed where you succeeded. Forgive me, but it seems more likely that you were simply fortunate, or that the story has grown taller with each retelling. Eleanor met his gaze steadily, feeling none of the old sting she once might have felt at being doubted so openly. "You are welcome to believe whatever you wish, sir. The clock chimes at Grantham House whether you believe it or not." The man had no answer for that, and after a moment of uncomfortable silence, He left the shop without buying anything at all. Eleanor's father, who had watched the entire exchange from behind the counter, laughed softly once the man had gone. "You have grown very brave, Eleanor," he said, "in a very short amount of time." "I do not feel brave, father," Eleanor admitted. "I only feel tired of pretending to be smaller than I am." Her father smiled at that, a warm, knowing smile that reminded Eleanor of the countless hours they had spent together in this small shop, teaching and learning, long before anyone outside these walls had known her name. Meanwhile, at Grantham House, the Duke had begun to consider what he owed to the young woman who had saved his family's most treasured possession. It was not simply a matter of payment, though he intended to pay her generously for her work. It was something larger than that, a debt he felt keenly every time he looked at the gently ticking clock in his hallway, a debt that no amount of money alone could properly repay. He summoned Margaret Doyle to his study one evening and asked her a question that surprised even her. "Tell me, Margaret," he said, "what do you know of Eleanor Whitfield's circumstances, her family, her prospects, what she might wish for herself if given the opportunity to ask for it?" Margaret considered the question carefully before answering. "From what I understand, Your Grace, she has spent her entire life working in her father's small shop, with very little recognition beyond the customers who happen to wander through the door. She has never had the chance that men of far less skill are given as a matter of course, simply because they were born into a position that opened doors for them without effort." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire crackling in his study. "Then perhaps," he said finally, "it is time someone opened a door for her instead." A week after the clock had been repaired, a formal invitation arrived at Whitfield's Clocks and Watches, carried by a young footman, who seemed almost nervous to be delivering it to such a small and modest address. Eleanor's father accepted it with trembling hands, and once the footman had gone, the two of them sat together at the kitchen table and read it twice through before either of them spoke. The Duke of Grantham requested the presence of Miss Eleanor Whitfield at his home, not as a craftsman summoned to complete a task, but as an honored guest, to discuss a matter of some importance regarding her future. Eleanor arrived at Grantham House 2 days later, dressed in the same plain gray dress she had worn during her first visit, though this time she was met at the door not by a suspicious guard or a stiffly polite butler, but by Margaret Doyle herself, who greeted her with a warm smile and led her directly to the Duke's study without delay. The Duke rose from behind his desk when she entered, a gesture of respect that startled her, given how few people of his standing had ever risen for someone like her. Charlotte sat nearby, unable to hide her eager smile. "Miss Whitfield," the Duke said, gesturing for her to sit. "Thank you for coming." "Of course, Your Grace. I have thought a great deal, these past days, about what you did for my family," he began, folding his hands on the desk before him. "It was not simply the repair of a clock, though that alone would have been remarkable enough. It was the manner in which you approached it. You did not force what did not wish to be forced. You listened, you studied, you understood, and only then did you act. I have rarely seen such patience and skill in anyone, of any age, of any background." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm at his words, unused to such open praise. "Thank you, Your Grace. I only did what my training has taught me to do." "And that," the Duke said, "is precisely the trouble, Miss Whitfield. Your training, remarkable as it clearly is, has been confined to a small shop on a narrow street, largely unnoticed by the wider world. I do not believe that is where your talent belongs." He reached into a drawer of his desk and withdrew a folded document, sliding it across the polished wood toward her. "I wish to offer you a position, Miss Whitfield, as caretaker of every clock and mechanism in this household, present and future, with a salary that reflects the true value of your skill, rather than the modest prices you have been charging for it. Beyond that, I intend to introduce you personally to every gathering of importance I attend in the coming months, so that London's finest families might come to know your name and your work, rather than dismissing it as they so nearly dismissed you." Eleanor stared at the document, her heart pounding, hardly able to believe what she was hearing. "Your Grace, I could not possibly." "You could, and I hope you will," the Duke said gently. "You saved something my family has treasured for generations, something 9 trained men could not save. I do not believe in leaving such a debt unpaid, nor do I believe in allowing talent as rare as yours to remain hidden simply because the world has not yet learned to look for it in the right places." Eleanor looked to her father, though he had not accompanied her that day, and then to Charlotte, whose eyes shone with genuine happiness on her behalf. Finally, she looked back at the document before her, at the careful, formal words that would change the shape of her entire life if she agreed to sign them. "I would not wish to leave my father's shop entirely, Your Grace," she said slowly. "It has been my home, and his for many years, but I would be honored to accept your offer, if I might continue to help him as well, whenever I am able." The Duke smiled, the first truly relaxed smile Eleanor had seen from him since she first arrived at Grantham House. "I would expect nothing less from someone with your character, Miss Whitfield. Your father's shop shall want for nothing, I assure you, once word of your talents has properly spread. I suspect he will find himself busier than ever." Eleanor signed the document with a hand that trembled slightly, not from fear this time, but from the sheer weight of what was happening. In a single week, her life had shifted from the quiet obscurity of a small shop to the bright, uncertain promise of a future she had never dared to imagine for herself. Word of the Duke's offer spread almost as quickly as word of the repair itself had. Some in London's wealthier circles murmured with disapproval at the idea of a shopgirl being elevated so suddenly, insisting that skill alone should not be enough to overcome the natural order of things. Others, particularly among the working families of the city, spoke of Eleanor with a fierce and quiet pride, as though her success belonged, in some small way, to all of them. Reginald Hargrove, upon hearing of the Duke's offer, sent a short, carefully worded letter to Eleanor at the shop, one that took him several attempts to write. In it he offered a stiff but sincere apology for his earlier dismissiveness, and admitted, with evident difficulty, that he had underestimated her skill entirely. Eleanor read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer, neither forgetting the sting of his earlier words, nor holding on to them with any real bitterness. She had learned, over the past weeks, that the opinions of those who doubted her mattered far less than the steady confidence she had finally found in herself. As the day of the Duke's gala approached, Grantham House buzzed with preparation once more, though this time the mood was one of celebration rather than dread. The great clock stood proudly in the hallway, its hands ticking steadily, its moondial turning through its slow and ancient rhythm, ready at last to chime for the anniversary it had been built, so many years before, to honor. On the night of the gala, Grantham House glowed with candlelight, every window bright against the darkening sky, every hallway filled with the low murmur of guests dressed in their finest clothes. Carriages lined the long gravel drive, and servants moved briskly between rooms, carrying trays of food and wine, adjusting the last small details before the evening truly began. Eleanor stood near the edge of the great hallway, dressed not in the plain gray wool she usually wore, but in a simple deep blue gown that Charlotte had insisted on having made for her, one that suited her far better than either of them had expected. She felt out of place among the glittering guests, the same way she had felt the very first time she walked through the tall iron gates of Grantham House, but this time, the feeling did not linger. She had earned her place here, and she reminded herself of that quietly, every time a curious glance lingered on her a moment too long. The Duke found her not long before the clock was due to chime the hour, marking the moment the gala's celebrations would formally begin. He looked, for the first time in weeks, entirely at ease, his earlier exhaustion replaced by a calm and steady pride. "Are you enjoying the evening, Miss Whitfield?" he asked. "I am, Your Grace, though I admit I feel a little like an intruder among such fine company." "You are no intruder here," the Duke said firmly. "You are, in every way that matters, the reason this evening is able to happen at all. Without your skill, we would be standing in a hallway with a broken clock and a shattered tradition, rather than celebrating 150 years of my family's history." Before Eleanor could answer, a soft chime rang out through the hallway, followed by another and another. The rich, full sound of the great clock striking the hour for the first time in front of a room full of guests since the accident had first occurred. Conversation slowly died away as heads turned toward the tall wooden case, its polished surface gleaming in the candlelight, its hands pointing precisely to the hour, its moondial glowing softly above the main face. A ripple of quiet applause moved through the room, and several guests turned, not toward the Duke, but toward Eleanor, whispers passing quickly from one small group to another. She felt her cheeks warm under the sudden attention, but she did not look away, did not shrink back the way she once might have. She stood tall, watching the clock she had brought back to life, and allowed herself, for the first time that evening, a small and genuine smile. Later, as the gala continued around her, Eleanor found a quiet moment to step away from the crowded hallway and stand alone before the great clock, studying it the way she had studied it that very first day, though everything about how she saw it now had changed. It was no longer simply a broken puzzle waiting to be solved. It was a reminder, standing tall and ticking steadily, of everything patience and careful attention could accomplish, even when the odds seemed impossibly stacked against success. "You look as though you are speaking to it," a familiar voice said behind her. Eleanor turned to find Charlotte standing nearby, smiling warmly. "Perhaps I am," Eleanor admitted. "It taught me a great deal, this past week, more than I expected a machine to teach anyone." "What did it teach you?" Eleanor considered the question carefully before answering. "That things which appear broken are not always broken in the way people assume. Sometimes they are only waiting, quietly, for someone patient enough to understand them properly, rather than someone determined to force them back into shape." Charlotte studied her for a long moment, then reached out and squeezed her hand gently. "I believe that is true of more than clocks, Eleanor." In the weeks and months that followed, Eleanor's name became known throughout London, not simply as the girl who had fixed the Grantham clock, but as a skilled craftsman in her own right, sought after by families who had once overlooked her entirely. She continued to work in her father's small shop whenever she could, refusing to abandon the place that had first taught her everything she knew, even as her reputation grew far beyond its narrow street. The other clockmakers of London, including Reginald Hargrove himself, eventually came to speak of her, not with resentment, but with a grudging, earned respect, the kind that could only be given to someone whose skill had proven itself beyond any reasonable doubt. The Grantham clock continued to tick steadily in its place of honor, its moondial turning through its slow and ancient rhythm, marking every anniversary, every celebration, every quiet ordinary day that followed. It had been built, generations before, by a craftsman skilled enough to create something that could track the movement of the stars themselves, and yet it took the patient hands of a plain, overlooked young woman to remind the world what that craftsman's careful work had truly meant. Eleanor Whitfield never forgot the lesson the broken clock had taught her that week, long after its hands had healed and its chime had returned to fill the halls of Grantham House once more. She carried it with her into every piece of work that followed, into every skeptical glance she met and quietly proved wrong, into every quiet, unremarkable morning spent bent over a delicate mechanism with a magnifying lens fitted over one eye. Some things, she had learned, were never truly broken beyond repair. They were only waiting, patiently, for someone willing to look closely enough to understand them. And in the grand hallway of Grantham House, long after the gala had ended and the guests had gone home, the great clock continued to tick softly through the night, keeping time exactly as it always had, and exactly as it always would, for as long as someone remained willing to listen to what it had to say.